the Irish Theosophists.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and welcome everybody. It's great to see a good crowd for a talk on Friday afternoon. I'm quite excited. I've prepared about 50 minutes of talk. I don't know how we are for timing, because we're timing may be different, but should we just play it by ear?
Yeah, play by ear,
yeah. But I can't, after that introduction, I'm going to give a diversion from my script, because I'm fascinated to hear that Marco Gachnik is known here, because I know his work very well, and have been involved in one part of my life, in the kind of work Brendan was talking about in England in the 1990s. Feels like there's an interesting crossing over of different influences. And probably just to pick up, you probably know very well, picked up from what Brendan was saying, but there are people who are experts on earth energies, the sacred landscape, the energies of the land, and how the roads or ley lines and the structures both the humans build and that are there in nature already affect everything that happens in the landscape, people, animals, the life forces themselves. And this became an important part of 20th century spiritual reawakening, what they call the New Age. And my wife Sally and I ourselves lived in Glastonbury for many years, and we visited Glastonbury for many years before we moved there. And in England, Glastonbury is sort of the centre of people who reawoke to ley lines and earth energies. And so Marco Gachnik, when he started doing this kind of work and taking it forward in the 70s and 80s, he was the heir to something that had already been growing in England and other places in the early 20th century. But what a lot of people don't realise, and I've started to realise increasingly from studying George Russell, is that the Glastonbury mystics and the earth energy workers were inspired by AE. And it's not very well known, because in England in the early 20th century there was a big reawakening to pre-Christian Celtic spirituality, the energies of the land, the old pagan understanding of stone circles, cromlechs and so on and so forth. And those key people in England in the 20s, they were reading AE, many of them knew Yeats, they knew about the Irish Theosophists, they were inspired in what they were doing by what AE and his friends had been doing in Dublin in the 1890s. So in many respects, I would say, the Dublin Theosophical Circle in the 1890s, trekking up to Kilmashogue in the Dublin Mountains, experiencing the memory of nature, working with the energies, seeing the fairies, they reawoke something that caught fire in England and then across the English-speaking world. And the more I look at it, as far as I can see, it was a sacred fire that was rekindled by A in his circle. And I find it fascinating that, because I was not expecting to hear Marco Gachnik mentioned, but I think this is where we start to see A's influence. It's much more far-reaching than many people realise. And I think the picture is only now starting to be fleshed out. So thank you, Brendan. I thought it was a perfect sort of way into what I'm going to be talking about, which is why is Theosophy and everything it led to so important, not just to A and his friends, but to what came after. And so after that preamble, I'll start with my talk as it's prepared. So, I was delighted to attend the launch of the A Society, the A Appreciation Society in Dublin last autumn. And among the various readings and discussions, and some of you that were there may have heard a letter that was read out from one of A.'s descendants, from A.'s family, who lives in America. And as well as giving his regards and his good wishes for the work of the society, I noticed he expressed dismay that his famous relative had been involved in Theosophy. This is fairly typical. Many people have heard rumours that the founder of the Theosophical Society, H.P. Blavatsky, was perhaps a charlatan or a fraud. The Theosophy was somehow bogus or unsavoury. And I found by talking to people, usually they can't tell you what Theosophy says or what Blavatsky did wrong, but the impression that she was a discredited fake remains. And I think this, on balance, this is unjust and it's really unfortunate. It does a disservice to A.E., who was not just a dreamer, but he was a very intelligent man who was actively involved in the work of the Theosophical Society for more than 10 years. And the ideas that came to him through Theosophy are perhaps the single most important influence, I believe, on his whole life. Everything he did, from his artwork, his poetry, to his practical work in agricultural organisation, he was all affected by his youthful immersion in spirituality and occultism, Eastern mysticism, and the Theosophical Society. So I would encourage all students and any relatives of AE that may see this talk later, not to feel embarrassed by his spiritual path, but to see he was simply too far ahead of his time for most people at the end of the 19th century, and I think we're finally catching up. So, to quote this from a letter that AE wrote to a correspondent of his, "You dismiss H.P. Blavatsky rather too easily as hocus pocus. Nobody ever affected the thought of so many able men and women by hocus pocus. The real source of her influence is to be found in The Secret Doctrine, a book on the religions of the world, suggesting or disclosing an underlying unity between all great religions. It's paying a poor compliment to men like Yeats, Maeterlinck, and others, to men like Sir William Crookes, the greatest chemist of modern times, who was a member of her society, Carter Blake, FRS, the anthropologist, and the scholars and scientists in many countries who read H.P. Blavatsky's books to assume that they were attracted by hocus pocus. If you're ever in the National Library, Kildare Street, and have a couple of hours to spare, you might dip into the proem to The Secret Doctrine, and you'll understand the secret of the influence of that extraordinary woman on her contemporaries." So this is A's imaginative painting of Madame Blavatsky. And I think you can see it reveals his intuition that she was not what she appeared to be to her critics. She was like a reborn ancient priestess or a seer, a restorer of sacred knowledge, and clearly indicates her possession of the powers of intuition, the higher mind, vision and seership. Now, Blavatsky was an extraordinary and a divisive figure. She had a fighter's temperament. She was congenitally tactless, but she tended to inspire uncritical worship in her followers and exaggerated critique, including, it has to be said, out-and-out lies and smear tactics from her opponents. Yet, as A. pointed out, what matters is whether her philosophy is valuable. That said, I wouldn't recommend that beginners to this subject take A.E.'s advice and begin with The Secret Doctrine. It's both poetic and profound as a description of the creation and the evolution of our world. Unless you've got a real appetite for mysticism or a strong background in philosophy, it may be hard going and put the casual reader off. I think there are many more accessible ways into the subject, including A.E.'s writings. But for this talk, I don't want to focus exclusively on Theosophy or Blavatsky. I thought it would be more interesting to step back a little and consider why a circle of young people in 1880s Dublin could take to some extremely unusual ideas so naturally and make them the basis of their entire lives. I want to bring some of these ideas down to earth and put them in context. Blavatsky's fusion of Western and Eastern ideas was revolutionary and explosive, and I hope to give some sense of where its excitement lay for A. Yeats and their friends. I've always been fond of this portrait of the young A by John Butler Yeats. It seemed an appropriate image to begin the main part of this talk. Art school has often proved to be a cosmopolitan, bohemian environment where free thinkers exchange new and radical ideas. John Butler Yeats, father of the poet William and painter Jack, had been destined for a legal career, but inspired by his dream of following a creative career, he'd given up the law and gone to art school in his late 20s, to the sometimes despair of his wife, who often had to support the Yeats household from her own family resources. From a young age, William Butler Yeats was determined to forge his own way as a poet and thinker, and I think he partly got that from his father's single-minded dedication to the creative life. Yeats himself wasn't a promising student, but from his youth he was passionately devoted to the power of literature and imagination. He was also interested in the kind of alternative ideas that permeated the art school environment and the wider literary bohemian circle. I believe it was as a student at the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin, where his father was teaching, that Yeats met A.E. Yeats himself wasn't a bad painter, but some fragments of his work survive at the former Theosophical household at 3 Upper Ely Place off Stephen's Green, Dublin, which we'll be looking at later. But A.E. at that time was already known as an extremely gifted artist. In his autobiographical reflections, Yeats implies that A.E. was regarded as something of a genius, even a holy fool by his fellow students. But what most of them didn't know is that A.E. was already a deep-thinking, visionary mystic. So I'm sure some of you have read A.'s autobiographical spiritual classic, The Candle of Vision, and if you haven't, I strongly urge that you do. In it, he describes how, as a teenage boy, to his surprise, he began to experience overpowering visions and intuitive apprehensions about the deeper reality of life, hidden behind its surface appearances. And some of these visions were presumably the kind of fairy figures in otherworld landscapes familiar in his paintings, but others were more arcane. This is a quote from The Candle of Vision. By the time I was 17 or 18, my brain began to flicker with vivid images. I tried to paint these and began with much enthusiasm a series of pictures which were to illustrate the history of man from his birth in the divine mind, where he glimmered first in the darkness of chaos in vague and monstrous forms, growing ever nigher to the human, to men beasts and men birds, until at last the most perfect form, the divine ideal of man, was born in space. I traced its descent into matter, its conflict with the elements, and finally the series ended in a pessimistic fancy, where one of our descendants, millions of years later, pens, a minute philosopher, a creature less than 3 inches in height, sat on one of our gigantic skulls and watched the skies running back into their original chaos and the stars falling from their thrones on a height. So this is what A was thinking about at the age of 18. I believe the painting of A displayed here is actually a tribute to the passage from The Candle of Vision. I'm not sure whether it was painted when A was 18, but it shows both his technical skill and his imagination that naturally ran to mythic subjects. The Candle of Vision also declares A's feeling that natural seership is not enough. The mystic also needs philosophy, interpretation, and spiritual path. And to anyone who knows something of Indian yoga philosophy, A has encoded clues about that path. The Candle of Vision in the title is itself the awakened power of the third eye from Indian yoga philosophy. Even the significance of the word eon, from which A drew his pen knife, was only interpreted when A discovered Gnostic literature, whose philosophy was very close to that of Blavatsky, as he later discovered. So it's worth taking a minute here just to reflect on what imagination and art really are. Most people in the West, or wherever modern education has spread, think visions are not real. Imagination is just imagination. But traditional societies believe in prophetic dreams, second sight, clairvoyance, and other worlds seen with the inner eye. Nowadays we have a sort of compromised middle ground between those views, the realm of fantasy literature and art, poetry. And we think the purpose of images is to entertain. The poet or author, therefore, invents surprising images that enthrall or divert us. But the ancient bards, druids, the seers, the prophets of Judaism, and many other religions, they described things that were seen that they thought were real. But seeing is not enough. We need training, philosophy, and interpretation. As even the Old Testament describes, the prophets had a school of learning how to interpret their visions. This training is described in great detail in the esoteric traditions of the East and the West. And in fact, most religions were founded by seers, visionaries, Gnostics. They were later taken over by specialists in social control. And the knowledge and interpretation and techniques also got lost. So, in view of Yeats and A's interests, it's unsurprising that they were both drawn very early to the English visionary mystic and painter William Blake. Huge influence on A and Yeats. Like A, Blake was a natural mystic and visionary. He was also an occultist, that's to say, student of one secret traditions that explain the relationships between God, humanity, and the universe. He was inspired by mystic Christianity, the Kabbalah, and the teachings of Swedenborg. And like Swedenborg, Blake was fascinated by heaven and hell, angels and demons, and he both saw and conversed with spiritual beings from a young age and throughout his life. But like John Milton, Blake was also fascinated by the rebel angel. All people that think deeply about the Bible probably ask themselves, why was there a fall? Why did Lucifer rebel against God? What was he like before his rebellion? This is Blake's vision of what he was like before he rebelled, when he was still with God. So needless to say, Blake was not a devil worshipper. But he knew, like other mystics, that there are deep mysteries in the story of the fall and the human condition. A.E. was also preoccupied by this. In his poetry, he makes many references to primal human beings in their primal spirituality, wearing a diadem and holding a scepter, as Blake's Satan does here. So you'll understand why A.E. would later be fascinated with Blavatsky, whose Theosophical magazine was called Lucifer. Now, William Blake was once denounced as that unfortunate lunatic, although he's now treasured as one of the great visionary artists of the world. And Blavatsky was accused of being on the side of Lucifer. Neither they nor A.E. were anything of the sort, needless to say, but they were trying to shock human beings into realising how we ourselves have fallen from grace. We've forgotten what we once were. We must remember. Just to set the scene for Theosophy in Dublin, in many respects the 19th century was a period of radical change. The French Revolution had showed that the monarchy, religion, ancient privilege can be overturned, society completely remade. Freedom and social justice became key concerns among liberals and progressives. Poets and musicians were inspired by the ideals of freedom of imagination, freedom of expression, and philosophers sought answers beyond European and Christian traditions. And the ancient mystery traditions began to be discussed in once again. But one influential event that made all this possible was the theory of subtle energy or life force, an ancient belief of the esoteric traditions of the world, which was rehabilitated by Dr. Franz Mesmer. And although scientists at the time said animal magnetism did not exist, in the age of new invisible physical forces that science was discovering, electricity, magnetism, radio waves, the electromagnetic spectrum, the idea of using invisible forces to heal seemed to many at the time to be supported by science and technology. Another crucial event, the fast-spreading movement of spiritualism, inaugurated in an era in which people believed they could make contact with spirits and prove the reality of the afterlife, and from the comfort of their own parlours without the need for priests or experts. Leading authors were also starting to refer to Kabbalistic, Hermetic, Rosicrucian traditions. This went as far as explicit defences of occultism, including republishing books of medieval magic, and the religiously tinged hermeticism of Eliphas Levi, who actually popularised the term occultism. During the same period, there was also increased contact and sharing between spiritual seekers from different nations and religions as the world opened out. Hindu yogis, Muslim Sufis could meet, Christian mystics, Masonic hermeticists, and all these ideas were cross-fertilising and being shared in an idea that there must be one truth and it could be found through sharing and putting together the best ideas of world spirituality. And of course we have to mention this was a century in which science arose as the dominant form of knowledge. Darwin's Origin of the Species was almost a fatal blow in the intelligentsia to belief in the infallibility of the Bible. And biblical scholarship was starting to study scriptural texts and undermine previous certainties. Lastly, the arts. Typical creative or bohemian freethinker of the time was politically liberal, interested in science, the East, in romanticism, cautiously interested in esoteric philosophy, increasingly sceptical of religious dogmas and outer churches. So, having given a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what was happening in the 19th century, this brewing ferment, if you imagine all these changes summed up in a movement that was aligned to Hermetic philosophy, ecumenical spirituality, radical politics, fascination with the East, deep feeling that visions are real, a sense that creativity in the arts is sacred, you'll see the 19th century was like a powder keg awaiting a fuse. And that fuse was Madame Blavatsky. So, Helena Petrovna von Hahn was a Russian noblewoman. In fact, she was born in modern-day Ukraine. She left her husband, General Blavatsky, shortly after marrying him. And from the age of 18, she travelled extensively in Europe, America, Africa, and India. From her youth, she was fascinated by Western mysticism, occultism, the Kabbalah, and so on and so forth. She later became active in the spiritualist movement as a medium, but she antagonised its leaders by claiming that the mediums were not actually in contact with the souls of the dead, which obviously upset them greatly, because She founded the Theosophical Society in 1875 in New York with two American citizens, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, who was a retired soldier and journalist, and William Quan Judge, who was a Dublin-born lawyer. But Blavatsky impressed Olcott and Judge with her knowledge and her seership and her apparent ability to create scientifically inexplicable phenomena. They were convinced in one round, and they co-founded the Theosophical Society with Blavatsky. Never before had anyone attempted to clearly explain esoteric philosophy in the West. Eliphas Levi and the Kabbalist literature, for example, was thoroughly symbolic, utterly unintelligible to most people who weren't in the study circle. Before Blavatsky, publicly accessible literature in the West gave no practical methods, no real demonstration that this philosophy had any truth in it, any relation to science or religion or philosophy. Or it was too religious to really be scientifically satisfying, too much of a cult nature. Blavatsky called her new synthesis Theosophy, which he thought was the synthesis of religion, philosophy, and science, an incredibly ambitious program. Now, although the founders were deeply interested in occult subjects, occultism was not the most important purpose of this Theosophical Society. Its three objectives, which we have on screen there, went through various iterations. This is the 1905 version. From the start, Blavatsky's spiritual teachers saw it as above all an idealistic and humanitarian movement to spread fraternity, goodwill, and mutual understanding among all the peoples of the earth. Philosophy, like, for example, Blavatsky's own writings, is the second objective. Practical occult study was only the third. So having founded the Society, Blavatsky's 1877 work, Isis Unveiled, was a landmark in philosophical religious studies, an extraordinary work, chaotically written. She was no scholar, but a mine of interesting information. But at this point, Theosophy was still very much a summary of traditional Western ideas, such as had been known to the Renaissance Phoneticists and later in certain secret societies. Yet she took the fight to the academic and establishment world of theologians and scientists by arguing that Theosophy bridged the best of religion and science, but also refuted their errors, therefore antagonizing all religious and scientific leaders of the time. She also pioneered the informed comparison of Western and Eastern esotericism, and included eyewitness accounts of her experience of shamans and fakirs that she'd seen in her travels. Not long after the publication of Isis, however, Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott travelled to Southeast Asia and India. They converted to Buddhism around 1880 in Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it then was. Always political, Blavatsky, on reaching India, developed contact with Hindu nationalists and the revival movement, the Arya Samaj, as well as various Hindu pundits that she discussed mysticism with. And meanwhile, William Judge was left in charge of Theosophy in America, which was a very challenging job, involving writing many articles, giving lectures, organising Theosophy groups across America, and continuing to work as a busy lawyer. But ultimately, Blavatsky and Olcott established a headquarters for their society in Adyar, in what was then called Madras and is now Chennai. Extraordinary developments in doctrine, cross-fertilization with Eastern movements were occurring. Her followers believed that she had the ability to manifest phenomena of the kind often seen in spiritualist circles, but more powerful than that. One individual who implicitly believed in her perhaps supposed powers was the English journalist Alfred Percy Sinnett. He was the editor of the leading English language periodical in colonial India, Pioneer. Converted to Theosophy by his belief in Blavatsky's phenomena, he requested contact with her fabled Indo-Tibetan spiritual teachers. He then came to realise that it was their philosophy and philanthropy they, Blavatsky, cared about far more than phenomena. But being a much better writer than Blavatsky, Sinnett took it upon himself to popularise this new Indian influence to doctrine, which was already considerably more challenging to 19th century readers even than our Isis Unveiled had been. Right. Sinnett's first book, The Occult World, sets out his intention clearly. There is a school of philosophy still in existence, of which modern culture has lost sight. Glimpses of it are discernible in the ancient philosophies with which all educated men are familiar. But these are hardly more intelligible than fragments of forgotten sculpture. But strange as the statement will appear at first sight, modern metaphysics, and to a large extent modern physical science, has been groping for centuries blindly after knowledge, which occult philosophy has enjoyed in full measure all the while. Another quote which illustrates Sinner's attempt to explain this radical new philosophy to a general readership is this. I've just spoken of the immaterial man in the human being, as distinguished from the body of the physical senses. But so complex is the statement I have to make, that I must no sooner induce the reader to tolerate that phrase, than I must reject it, for the future is inaccurate. Occult philosophy has ascertained that the inner ethereal self, which is the man as distinguished from his body, is itself the envelope of something more ethereal still, is itself, in a subtle sense of the term, material. So you see how he is struggling to explain radical new philosophy to a readership. These subtle bodies, this immaterial man, these are realities that seers like Blavatsky and also A.E. could see as clearly as the physical things around us with their inner eyes. And that's important when you remember A.E.'s paintings, that he was a lifetime seer. I'll skip over this to save time. I think because of time, I'm going to pass over what I was going to talk about here, and maybe we'll come back to it at the end if it's important. Okay. So, now I'm conscious that I started this talk with A.E. and Yeats, and then backtracked to the growth of the 19th century occult revival and why Theosophy made such an impact and was radical. But this brings us back to our Dublin students. Unsurprisingly, it was Yeats who first encountered Sinner's Theosophical books and transmitted his interest to A.E. The next important addition to this study circle was another school friend of Yeats, Charles Johnston, who'd been born in Ballykilbeg, and as I've said in another lecture, his background could hardly have been more unionist. His father, William Johnston, was an MP for South Belfast and a member of the Orange Order. He was often described as a brilliant student. Johnston was an exceptional linguist, and had originally intended to become a Christian missionary. Yet, won over to Theosophy, he co-founded the Dublin Hermetic Society in 1885 with A.E. and Yeats. But even though Yeats was only, of the three, only Yeats had reached the age of 20 when they founded the Hermetic Society in Ireland, and A.E. and Johnston were a couple of years younger than Yeats. You can see that this was already an impressive society. The blend of occult philosophy, visionary powers and scholarship represented by the main founders was unique, and it remained typical of Irish theosophy well into the 20th century. It should also be noted that whereas the split between Western and esotericism was hardening in London, in Dublin, Hermetic Society, Theosophical Society were still interchangeable names. Throughout their lives, the Irish Theosophists, A.E. and others, maintained a healthy respect for all valuable wisdom they found, whether at the East or the West. So, now, some of you will know all about what I've been talking about so far, but perhaps some others may have a sensation that you're entering a weird and unfamiliar new world. Most of the technical language I've used, or at least the ideas they represent, were utterly familiar to A.E. Yeats and the Hermetic Society from their early youth, because they were basics of relevant literature. But for many people, these ideas are discovered in books, and they resonate with personal experience. And this leads students to immerse themselves in the literature and meeting people with shared ideas, until these terms become perfectly normal and factual. But they often remain strange or even sinister to people that haven't studied the literature. So I'm just going to give some brief characterizations of these terms, because you'll have heard me using them more going ahead. So, Hermeticism or Hermetic philosophy. This means the philosophy based on the Hermetica, which are a set of religious philosophical texts authored in ancient Alexandria, the capital of Egypt in the early Christian era. They were based on the maxim that what is above is like what is below, and what is below is like what is above, and imply that fundamentally there is no separation between religion and science. And some of the Hermetica are very religious and highly compatible with Christianity, but others are more philosophical or even esoteric. The medieval traditions of alchemy, which eventually gave rise to chemistry, were closely linked to Hermeticism. Another term, Theosophy. This is a term that also came from Alexandria. It means divine wisdom, or knowledge that goes beyond what we can know merely by thinking or doing experiments. Esotericism. It's often taken to mean knowledge studied in secret or by secret societies, inner knowledge, and thus it links to gnosis, which means direct spiritual knowledge, in contrast to speculations by the merely rational mind. Occultism, 19th century term. It approximately means the study of what is hidden from the normal senses. That includes atoms of physics, but also non-physical forces of the kind that A studied in Indian yoga. It's got nothing to do with spooky ceremonies or black candles or anything of that nature. Mysticism, a path towards direct experience of ultimate reality. Through stilling the mind and the personal self, turning inwards and becoming receptive. So A was a natural mystery. We'll just let this.
It's another word intruding, you know.
Not at all. Okay, so for those in the audience who may be inspired to dig deeper into this side of AE, the mystical side, I've just listed some technical terms that it's helpful to know. We explore them in much more detail in our forthcoming book on the history of Irish magic, which I'll mention at the end. So the Upanishads, ancient Indian philosophical texts on the nature of reality, so profound that advanced European philosophers in the 19th century recognized their importance. The Bhagavad Gita, an ancient Indian text teaching the nature of the divine, duty, action without attachment, many philosophical concepts. And both of these texts were central to Abe's thought throughout his life. He had been reading, meditating, and teaching them for a while. More technical terms now, the astral body. Many ancient cultures believed that humans have other bodies than the physical. Sinnett was talking about this as the immaterial man. In ancient Greek, they were called the ochemata, vehicles, and the Indians used similar terms. Now, in Theosophy, astral body sometimes means the invisible life forces in a human being, or it can also mean the vehicle in which we travel when we dream, or visit distant locations in full consciousness, hence astral travel. Now, A believed he had the proof of his ability to travel in his astral body. He described this in a letter to William Sharp, where he says, essentially, someday I'll project myself and we may meet in the other realm. We may not recognise each other. We may already have met and not recognise each other because our forms in that world are different to our forms here. So he was a firm believer in the reality of astral travel. Chakras. So the subtle body that I've mentioned has sense organs. In Indian occultism, these are called chakras. The term's quite widespread now. In A's time, it was only known to a few Westerners, largely the Theosophical Society. It's through the chakras, notably the third eye, that clairvoyant perception of invisible realms, fairyland, heaven, the realm of the souls in the afterlife, is possible. And A was a lifelong natural clairvoyant, but he also worked hard to open his chakras through yoga. Which brings me on to yoga. So yoga is not just an Indian form of gymnastics, but it refers to a whole class of techniques for the human being to reunite with God, with the divine, using devotion or knowledge or willpower or various methods. A successful yogi who follows these disciplines, as Abe did, can awaken perhaps the power called Kundalini. Kundalini is said in Indian philosophy to be a fiery power that sleeps at the base of the spine. Through yoga practice, you can awaken this serpent power so that it rises up the spine, and when it reaches the brain and the top of the head, it gives radiant experiences of vision, illumination, spiritual freedom. Now, if you return to the candle of vision, you'll see that he gives a very clear description of the yoga practice leading to his Kundalini awakening. And he says he lost confidence at the crucial moment and missed the chance to go to the highest levels of enlightenment. But this is what he's talking about. This is from Indian yoga teachings. Okay. So, moving on to the late 1880s, Theosophy, Hermetic Society has been gathering strength in Dublin. It's attracting new members. Irish Theosophy is also beginning to find its own unique culture and identity at the time. Bigger than was the Dublin Chief Judge visited Ireland, I think his first return to his native land since he'd left at the age of 13. He vastly impressed the Dublin Theosophists, particularly AE. He had a very personal vision of Ireland's nature, of its link with the ancient continent of Atlantis, the great mysteries of Atlantis, and also Ireland's relationship to America. And Judge had a particular blend of theosophy, occultism, Irish mythology, and his own dreamlike visions. And this, in some ways, became the template for the style of the Irish Theosophists magazine, particularly the AE's writing. So, Judge, underrated for his influence on AE, but very important. Around this time, though, Charles Johnston left Ireland never to return. He sought work in India, travelled the world, finally residing in America. But his translations of Indian spiritual texts, because he was a great Sanskrit scholar, were treasured by the Irish Theosophists and Hermetic Society for decades after his departure, and he stayed in contact with AE and his friends throughout their lives. Frederick Dick, a wealthy civil engineer, bought for the Theosophical Society a fine Georgian townhouse, 3 Upper Ely Place, which is just off Stephen's Green, and that became. Just look at this, I like this picture. So this is Charles Johnston with Blavatsky's niece, Vera Jelikovsky. They married. So Charles Johnston became very close to the Blavatsky family. That's Olcott, that's Blavatsky's sister. So just to give you a sense of how personally the Irish Theosophists connected with Blavatsky and the movement. So 3 Upper Ely Place, the household or homestead as it was sometimes called. So very grateful to the present owner of 3 Ely Place who gave Sally and I permission to take these pictures about 10 years ago. Just to give a quick sense of the environment in which Dublin Theosophy was taking place, you can see the artwork in the ground floor sitting room in Ely Place was done by AE, but also by Yates, so that their bits of artwork are signed by them on the mural walls. Sadly, most of it is lost, but what survives show there must have been an amazing room to have discussions and meditations in. You can see typical AE mythological big fairy beings, the radiance around the head, the almost Blakean majesty of the figure. So I'm just going to rush through some of these to give you a flavour. You can see the winged figure and the very Blakean figure at the top. And close up of these 2 beings. So you can see AE is developing his distinctive artistic style, which you recognise from his many paintings. The extraordinary use of colour. So when people are thinking about the Theosophical Society, it may seem dry if people are just studying books, but they're meditating and they're surrounded by this extraordinary imaginative art. They must be constantly being stimulated. Right, okay. So, just a flavour of the environment of the household as the Theosophical Society's property was known. For most of the 1890s, it resembled nothing so much as a theosophical lay monastery. Celibacy was expected of those who were following the most committed spiritual path, which is quite a challenge for people in their 20s. In fact, there's a story that when Charles Johnston married Blavatsky's niece, there was some disapproval that he was sacrificing the celibate path to get married, and that was also criticised as being far too sanctimonious by some of his friends. But vegetarianism was basic to this household. There was a vegetarian restaurant next door to the household. So this was a place in which there would have been the study of theosophy, meditation, yoga practice of the kind I mentioned, meetings of the Theosophical Lodge for a wider audience. These meetings were advertised in the press. But as the main activity that drew them together and forced them really to work was the publication of the Irish Theosophists magazine. I'm pleased to see there's an example of it over there that you can see, which is a very high quality magazine actually, which still makes good reading. But they weren't just working indoors. Going back to Brendan and Marco Bogachnik from the beginning, there were frequent tours into the Dublin mountains, usually led by AE, where A would open to his friends who perhaps couldn't see with the inner eye like he could, the two de Dannen, to be able to see in the memory of nature, A believed that you could see scenes of what had happened in the past that were still there in the ethers, and he could open that to himself and others. So there was this wonderful culture of going out into nature, connecting with earth energies, then returning and meditating. Creative writing, the arts, poetry were all being created in this household, and also various psychic and magical experiments that we'll maybe talk about at the end. Some famous anecdotes from the time. So who was there? Well, A was the most consistently present resident of the household. He lived there for most of its active operation. He was a natural leader, really, of this group of people. His articles and editorials sometimes had the flavour of a parish magazine or even a sermon. He was almost like the minister of this group of people, you might say. His clairvoyance and his fiery faith in Theosophy and Judge gave him a fervour that inspired others around him. Another was Daniel Nicol Dunlop, who was a Scottish Theosophist, and he was a very energetic businessman. He was a wine merchant, a restaurateur. He edited the Irish Theosophist. He was also a follower of an American spiritual sect led by Thomas Lake Harris, who had some very interesting doctrines. They were into free love, the mysteries of sex and magic, and they sold wine grown on their own vineyard in their American commune, really. So the story that we'll tell at the end about Dunlop and AE is against the background of Thomas Lake Harris. But another vital member of the household was James Morgan Price, who we'll come to in a moment. But he was a Welsh-American occultist, an expert printer. He was the printer of the Irish Theosophists, but he also printed Blavatsky's secret papers for her esoteric section of the Theosophical Society. So he had access to material that wasn't known to most of the Theosophists. That's Mr. Price, James Morgan Price. Now there you can see Price with Blavatsky in her, when she was in her really final illness. And that's George Mead, Blavatsky's secretary, who went on to write some really important books on gnosis, hermeticism, philosophy, still regarded well by scholars to this day, George Mead. Also worth looking at his face, because as we'll come on to in a minute, A said there was an important Irish spiritual teacher who had a face that was a bit like George Mead, that A had seen in his inner vision. So just to flag that up. Another important figure for A at this time, although she didn't live at the household, she's part of the Morgan Price circle, is Julia Cakeley, who wrote under the pseudonym Jasper Neiman. She had been a close associate of William Kwan Judge, and she knew all about the chakras and prana that we were talking about earlier, Indian yoga teachings. Now, again, bringing it back to Brendan, once you grasp the concept that there are subtle energies in the body, you can make the connection that there are subtle energies in the land. A had a special name for these. He describes them in his poetry and writing, and calls them the fountains of Hecate, Hecate being the Greek name for the goddess, really. So just as the body has these invisible centres of power, so the landscape has these fountains of life energy and spots of particular energetic significance. So it was through working with Morgan Price and Julia Cakeley that A is really awakened into this way of seeing the world. So the Irish Theosophists, I said, it's a really worthwhile magazine. It's actually a good read, even if you're not a believer in Theosophy. It's a high-quality publication. It has articles on Theosophy, but also personal reflections, poetry, prose plays. Some of A's best verse in his first two collections, Homeward Songs by the Way and The Earth Breath, were poems first printed in the Irish Theosophists, and often because he had a duty to produce copy for each issue. So he was forced to write, and it brought some great writing out of him. So this was where the Irish Theosophy blend of ancient Mediterranean lore, Celtic fairy lore, and Theosophy really congealed, and A became the exemplar of it. I've said here, A's theosophical writings are neglected clues to his paintings and poetry. And I've noticed this, is that I haven't often seen that the people who know his paintings don't read his Theosophy, and the people who know Theosophy don't look at his paintings. But if you cross-reference them, you'll see that the paintings are actually illustrating his ideas about the spiritual life and esoteric teaching. So I'm going to give one example, which is a phrase he uses in many writings, the dragon crest. He describes the beings of the she to the Dedan as having this dragon crest, or also awakened human beings. And just to give you some examples of this from a few selected paintings, you see the sort of crest on the head there, or this figure here. This is from the Museum of Art Market, many thanks for permission to show this. The Prince of Tin and Oak, again you see the sort of floral imagery of the head energies, or this water spirit here. This stunning piece of work also from Armagh. So, let's leave that there. So when A is talking about this kundalini, this fiery meditation on the self, this concentration that he's urging his students to do, his belief is that the two Dedan gods of Ireland were human beings once, but they practiced this spiritual discipline. They awakened the energies in the body, the fiery forces rose to their head, and the fact that they became as gods is shown by this crest. So this is just one example of many of the clues that get neglected in what A's paintings are actually showing. So, unfortunately, by the late 1890s, there was a split in the Theosophical Society. Judge had felt that he should take over after Blavatsky died, but Blavatsky had appointed Annie Besant to be her successor. There was a bitter factional war between the Theosophists in Europe and India and those in America. Judge's faction, who the Irish Theosophists were closer to, succeeded, but then Judge died the year after it, leaving the global Theosophical Society in an embattled state, which in some ways it never really recovered from, because their ideal of universal fraternity was shattered by this dispute. And at this time, you see A's writings, the flavour of them slightly changed. They become a bit more strident when his article from the Irish Theosophist, Priest or Hero, is strongly anti-clergy article. He's becoming more political, more pointed. He and the others around him are becoming more focused on political goals and practical outcomes. Maybe they've reached a time where after 5 years of studying meditation, they're looking for a more tangible outcome for their spirituality. Daniel Dunlop and James Morgan Price went to America. W.B. Yeats had left Theosophy at this point. He's in the Golden Dawn and thriving in the Western environment. And A's spiritual vision changes as well. He becomes more interested in magic, in nature, in the goddess, and in druidism. All of these themes becoming more important in his later career. And one way this happened is in this convergence of concerns is in the concept of the Irish avatar. So from the mid-1890s, A's visions were coming about the Irish avatar, and also a teacher who was close to the avatar and would point the way to him. Avatar, again, a term that's become quite popular now. It's a Hindu term for an incarnation of the divine. The Irish Theosophists were looking for a smaller scale, an Irish avatar who would bring renewal and salvation in Ireland. There was a strong political subtext to this. It was to do with Irish cultural revival, linguistic, literary, mythical, political, and home rule was always part of this too at the time. So both A.E. and Yeats, even though they were following different paths, they were in contact about this Irish avatar. They were both looking for Irish spiritual powers to save Ireland's culture and bring her freedom. And this coalesces around the image of the avatar. So, this image again, I'm not sure if anyone else has cross-referenced this, but there's a letter of A.E. to Yeats in 1897, where he describes in a vision having seen a cottage in the west of Ireland where there's a great spiritual teacher, and this cottage is protected by a very tall spiritual being. The teacher is in close contact with the Irish avatar, And A feels sure that if he saw this cottage in real life, he'd recognise it, he'd knock on the door, nothing would stop him. So he writes to Yeats, inviting Yeats to go on a walking holiday with him to the northwest of Ireland on this quest for the Irish initiate and the path of the Avatar. I don't know if this happened, but this was a passion in 1897. So, Dublin Theosophy, although the household is on the point of breaking up, it's attained a very strong identity. And I'll just summarise some of the things that mattered to the people at that time. Rediscovering Ireland's spiritual destiny. Restoring the teachings that explain Irish myth through Indian and Theosophical comparisons. Walking in the hills and sacred places, seeing the memory of nature. Recovering the meaning of Druidism, Irish magic, and the ancient mysteries. And above all, putting it all into literature and the arts. So, I thought, I'm just going to, because we've talked so many ideas, I'm going to take a break to read a poem of A's, which I think captures some of the themes at the time.
Jim, just car park closes at 6:15.
Right.
Thanks.
How much longer shall I speak for? I haven't got much more to say.
What happened?
6:12.
If you hold it though, that's okay, yeah. It's, a few more minutes, that's okay.
Okay, no, that's fine. Because I would like to leave time for a couple of questions and observations as well. Right. I'm going to skip the next bit. Does everyone find for parking? Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Where's that image?
That image is,
Somewhere.
it's Deirdre at her doing. And I was going to be talking about A and Yeats's role in theatre, and how theatre was one way they were trying to re-energise Ireland and bring mythic and spiritual energies into Irish culture. So obviously A didn't write many plays, he was a great playwright, but his Deirdre was quite influential in the beginnings of Irish theatre. And so this is an example of his vision around her at that time. So, I'll start to wrap up this and then just give a brief afterwards to Irish Theosophy and how A's vision carried on after he became busy doing other things. So, many of you will know great poet Patrick Kavanagh called A great and holy man. A had always been exceptionally generous and unselfish, but I hope you can start to see that A thought he had a spiritual mission to help the Irish Avatar and the initiates to help rejuvenate Irish culture. And obviously poets being the soul of the nation would be crucial to that cultural rejuvenation. A sponsored young struggling poets throughout his life. He kept a special charity fund to support them, encouraged really anyone of poetic talent to rise. Including James Joyce, who was actually often quite mean about it. So, Joyce's choice witticisms, such as calling the Celtic twilight the cultic toilette, and ribbing A as calling him the dreamery, creamery butter, and so on. But no, he helped Joyce and many others. So, we're drawing to the end of what I wanted to speak, the main part of what I wanted to speak about today. But if I could sum it up in one sentence, it would be this. When you read A's poetry or look at his paintings, bear in mind they reflect his theosophical beliefs, his yoga practice, and his particular kind of clairvoyant vision very precisely. So these things are not necessary if you want to enjoy A's work in your own way. Not at all. They can be enjoyed in your own terms. But if it matters to you what his creative work meant to him, it's essential. The Candle of Vision is not a misty, impressionistic book. It's a very precise, lucid account of his path to understanding life through his vision and the philosophy he developed to understand his visions. So from around 1900, as we know, A was extremely busy working in the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society and then as a writer and editor of journals. He painted in his spare time and continued to write poetry, though rather less. However, the impulse of Dublin Theosophy lived on through others, who he and the household had inspired. So I'm going to close by mentioning a few of them. I've spoken at greater length about some of these figures in my talk to Dr. Jamie Butler's seminar at the University of Cork, and they receive a much closer analysis in our forthcoming book. So if you want more information about them, I'd like to signpost you to those. But I did want to speak about James and Margaret Cousins, because they're both wonderful figures and they've been neglected. I hope that will soon change. James Cousins was born in humble circumstances in Belfast. Margaret was from Boyle in Roscommon. Both were from Methodist backgrounds. Typically for that faith, they were concerned with women's rights, suffrage, anti-slavery, vegetarianism, and various other social justice issues. And so they also both became interested in spiritualism. Inspired by A.E., James Cousins systematically educated himself, and from the late 1890s became part of the Dublin creative and theosophical scene. He wrote poetry and plays, acted in the first production of Yeats's Kathleen the Houlihan, in which Maud Gonne had taken the leading role. Meanwhile, Margaret was very politically active. In 1908, she was the co-founder of the Irish Women's Franchise League with Hannah Sheehan Skeffington. As a prominent suffragette, she'd been arrested in London following a protest and served a 1-month sentence in Holloway Prison. And after a similar protest in Dublin, she was also imprisoned in Tullamore Jail for 1 month. It was perhaps her political involvement that drew her to Annie Besant, despite A.E.'s abiding grudge against Annie Besant for her treatment of William Quine Judge. Through their connection with Besant, after emigrating to India in 1915, James became the vice principal of Madinapale College, among other responsibilities, and Margaret co-founded the Women's Indian Association. Among many other achievements, she became the first woman magistrate in India in 1922, and she founded the All India Women's Conference in 1927. The point being, what is not often realised is that Irish Theosophists were very influential on Indian thought leaders, particularly in regard to the issue of home rule. So just as the Irish Theosophists' original quest for cultural origins in Indian spirituality had inspired their political resistance as well, so later the Indians were inspired in turn by the Irish Theosophists. Several years before the Candle of Vision, A.E.'s great work, was published, James Cousin had written The Wisdom of the West, which also analysed Irish myths by comparison with Greek and myth and Indian philosophy. His work was considerably ahead of its time in its treatment of comparative mythology, and it makes a fascinating counterpart to A.E.'s work. So I mentioned Dan Dunlop earlier. Having left the household, he had a glittering career in America. He became a prominent executive at Westinghouse and later set up the World Power Conference. He is to this day remembered as a pioneer in the energy sector. He eventually became a follower of Rudolf Steiner, the former leader of the German section of the Theosophical Society, who had broken away from the main society. In the last years of his life, Steiner became very close to Dunlop, and Steiner, who was giving lectures all across Europe at the time, spoke much about the ancient mysteries, particularly the Hibernian mysteries of Ireland and the Druids. I think this was partly through Dunlop's influence. Steiner came to regard the Irish mysteries as the highest ancient wisdom teachings of them all. Steiner in turn influenced other 20th century writers on Irish and Celtic spirituality and Druids. Like A.E., Steiner was deeply committed to agricultural reform and cooperative organisation. So this sense that the Irish Theosophy was always going to have to lead to practical action on behalf of nature, I think is a persistent theme. Very briefly, John and Agnes Varian. So I don't have a picture of Agnes, but this is John Varian. He'd been part of the Dublin Theosophical scene in the early 1890s. They left Ireland for New York in 1894. And then later in that decade, they travelled across the country to California, to Halcyon, California, to be part of a theosophical community called the Temple of the People. And even there in the far west, John Varian was representing the impulse of Irish theosophy. He wrote Irish mythological poetry and sang Irish ballads as well, influencing the American modernist and spiritual scene in California. he collaborated with a prominent American composer called Henry Cowell. And I'm sorry we can't play any of Cowell's music, but he set his poetry and also created memorable pieces like The Tides of Manannan, wonderful evocations of Irish mythology through music. So this is one of the buildings from the Temple of the People in Halcyon, which is still going, and where that Irish theosophical impulse still has a faint but definite presence. I'm going to skip over these for reasons of time, because I do absolutely want to finish with Arto Monahan. So, Arto Monahan was a friend of Ellie Young, who we'll show next. He was an outstanding artist and illustrator. His Book of the Rising is one of the great, unpublished, unrecognised works of Irish 20th century art. Sally is the great expert, and if you have any questions about Arto at the end, I would refer you to Sally. He was a theosophist. He was a mystic and a natural seer, he was fascinated by megalithic sites. He researched Newgrange, Tara, other sites. He tried to combine what he was learning about these sites from spiritual teachings of Theosophy with academic and archaeological research, and he was devoted to this throughout his life. He was part of a secret Druid lodge of the Hermetic Society in the 1930s, which had sort of been started by A.E., but had been developed by P.G. Bowen, who we don't have time to talk about, unfortunately. So he's combining an interest in the Druids with the Hermetic teachings of the West. And this page is a page from the Book of the Rising, which I particularly wanted to show because this is the page devoted to Ulster. Arto Monahan was born in England, but his father was from Lochbritland, so in many respects a local character. And you can see, if we had time to go into this more in more detail, you can see the red hand of Ulster there. You can see Armagh, Ardmacca there. So what we have here is a sort of beautiful symbolism of medieval scribal Christian imagery with symbols from mysticism and theosophy all woven together in this wonderful artwork. So this is just one of over 20 marvelous images from Arto Monahan that are filled with spiritual symbolism. Particularly thrilled to be showing it actually at the end of this talk. So, yeah, Ellie Young has to be mentioned really. Again, from Northern Ireland Protestant background, a poet, a successful author. She had been part of AID's circle in the 1890s in Dublin, and she gives a wonderful description of going with AID's group to the place she called Kilnashee, the Church of the Fairies, and she describes how AID had the ability to open out the memory of nature and to lead people on these unforgettable spiritual trips into the mountains and share the earth energies. Her autobiography, Flower and Dusk, is soon to be republished, which may be mentioned at the end of this. And again, for anyone who wants a flavour of what Amy's circle was really like in the 1890s and the living spirit of Irish Theosophy, Ellie Young is a master writer who will bring it to your imagination. Ellie Young, like several of the others, she left Ireland for America. She emigrated permanently, I think, in 1925. And when she went, she took a sheet of Arto Monahan's work for this Book of the Rising with her, with the idea that it might help raise funds when the Irish Americans and other patrons see this wonderful work being done. But I don't think it's known whatever happened to this piece of art she took to America. It's lost. But she became probably the most popular and successful presenter of Irish mythology to an American audience, and played a great part, among other things, in popularising Celtic spirituality and Irish myth. And she lived for a considerable amount of time at Halcyon, California, at the Temple of the People, where she became part of the bohemian circle of Theosophists, artists, musicians like Henry Cowell, and also the great photographer Ansel Adams, who took this photograph, the stunning photograph of her. So, wrapping up, this is the last slide, and I'd like to just finish by reading some of Aidan's words. I want to define what the Irish Theosophists developed as their style of working in the 1890s, and what I think can still speak to us, and why these ideas, which might seem abstract, can come to life and inspire incredible creativity. So, the devotion to ancient Indian and Mediterranean spirituality and philosophy. For some mysterious reason, the Irish Theosophists were fascinated by the ancient Indian texts, even more than most of the Theosophists. Charles Johnston became a great Sanskrit scholar. He read the Upanishads throughout his life. He did yoga practice. They felt a resonance with these ancient teachings that was not just academic, it was living to them. They felt the answers to what it meant to them to be Irishmen in Dublin in the 1880s and 90s was being communicated to them through these some of the oldest books in the world from India. It's a remarkable fact. Secondly, the expression of philosophy through creativity in the arts, which are cultural and political forces. The arts build society. I think this is where the Irish Theosophists, almost more than any other spiritual movement, are unique, that they were fired, and this would include Yeats too, to create great art, great poetry, theatre, painting, to portray a vision that, because it was based in spiritual teachings and reality, would transform society for the better, and specifically would transform Ireland for the better. And thirdly, not just human society, but the land. Like, to A throughout his life, and to the circle around A, a living connection with the land, walking, communing, devotion to it is inseparable from the highest abstract teachings. And I think, again, this is so important, because without that, this can just seem like religious theory, and it doesn't heal and transform. So that was what I wanted to say, but I'd like to finish by reading an excerpt from A's Candle Vision, where he's uniting his own with Theosophy, with Irish myth, and his own particular style. So here we go. In the beginning was the boundless lyre, an infinite depth, an invisible divinity, neither dark nor light, in whom were all things past and to be. There at the close of the divine day, time being ended, and the nuts of knowledge harvested, the gods partake of the feast of age, and drink from the secret fountain. Their being there is neither life nor death, nor sleep nor dream, but all are wondrously wrought together. They lie in the bosom of Lyre, cradled in the same peace. Those who hereafter shall meet in love or war or in hate. The great Father and the Mother of the gods mingle together, and heaven and earth are lost, being one in the infinite Lyre. Of Lyre but little may be affirmed, and nothing can be revealed. In trance alone the seer might divine beyond his ultimate vision, this being. It is a breath with many voices which cannot speak in one tone. We have first of all Lyre, an infinite being, neither spirit nor energy nor substance, but rather the spiritual form of these, in which all the divine powers raised above themselves exist in a mystic union of trance. This is the night of the gods, from which Manannán first awakes, the most spiritual divinity known to the ancient Gael, being the Gaelic equivalent of that spirit which breathed on the face of the waters. He is the root of existence from which springs the sacred hazel, the symbol of life ramifying everywhere. And the forms of this life are conceived first by Manannán, the divine imagination. Hazel. It throws itself into 7 forms or divinities. The branches, and these again break out endlessly into leaves, blossoms and fruit, into myriads of divine beings, the archetypes and ancestral begetters of those spirits who are the children of Lyre. All these are first in the divine darkness and are unrevealed, and Manannán is still the unuttered word, and is in that state the Chaldaic oracle of Proclus saith of the divine mind. It had not yet gone forth, but abode in the paternal depth, and in the additum of God nourished silence. But Manannán, while one in essence with the paternal Lyre, is yet, as the divine imagination, a separate being to whom thus brooding, Lyre seems apart, or covered over with a veil, and this aspect of Lyre, a mirage which begins to cover over true being, Dana, the Hibernian mother of the gods, or Sinan in the antique Dinchenkus, deity first viewed externally, and therefore seeming to partake of the nature of substance, and as the primal form of matter, the spirit of nature. The Mammon alone of all the gods exists in the inner side of this spirit, and therefore it is called his mantle, which flung over man or god, wraps them from the gaze of embodied beings. Thank you very much. So, yeah, sorry, because we were running over a bit, I chopped out some bits, but if there are any questions or any observations, now is the time.
There's very little mention of Val. You know, but she was a Theosophist as well. Did she get her Theosophism before she came down?
I'm not aware that she did. I'll tell a story which illustrates how involved she was at the household, and this is from Ella Young's Flowering Desk memoirs. And we know that she was very enthusiastic and active in the Theosophical Society from at least the 1893. So Ella Young was visiting the household in, I think, about 1895 or thereabouts, check the date, and she finds that Violet North, later to become Violet Russell, and her friend Kenneth Morris, who was a Welsh writer who became an important early science fiction writer, were full of enthusiasm because they decided they were Muslims. That they're in this Theosophical house with A's mystic paintings. They had converted to Islam. They covered the walls with Arabic writing of verses from the Quran, and they were in an uproar. And A, in the end, interceded and said, "This won't do. This is a Theosophical house." But I think it illustrates the spiritual excitement and the possibility of different religions of that time. Violet North was obviously an intelligent and vivacious person. I don't know anything about her work before she came. I also haven't seen any of her theosophical writing. You're absolutely right, Jim. She was a key part of the household. Which, you know, you couldn't imagine that A would have married her if she hadn't been.
Okay. Thank you.
But actually, I'll tell another story from the household now, because this is another famous incident that's narrated in the Candle of Vision, but A doesn't say who it is. A tells a story describing, you know, such things as telepathy that seem impossible to skeptics but were normal to him. And A describes a situation in which he was sitting in the household, brooding, thinking, and a friend of his comes into the house in a state of agitation, unusually uncommunicative, obviously bothered by something. And A essentially says, "How are you? You're right." And this person says, "What will be, will be," and goes up to his room in a mood. Obviously paraphrase it. Now this person was Daniel Nicol Dunlop, and A didn't know the subtext to it, but what he describes is this. He said, "I was worried about my friend. I knew he was going through a spiritual battle, so I essentially meditated and tuned into him. And I could then see what he was going through. I saw two spiritual beings, essentially one over each shoulder, and one of them was this lurid red being who A thought reminded him of being having the cruelty and the power of an ancient king filled with lust and sensuality and ruthlessness. And then A saw this blue being that was quite the opposite of spirituality and in no way a controlling being. And A said he was seeing in vision his friend going through this battle. Will his friend choose the red being or the blue being? And he saw in the end that his friend chose the blue being, and then the lurid red being dissipated. And this actually was the big choice Dunlop was going through. It's like, do I do Theosophy, or do I follow Thomas Lake Harris's sexual teachings? And the point being, A said quite clearly that he didn't know this, but he saw in real time what his friend was going through in the upstairs room in the household. And this apparently is quite normal for A. Various of his friends, including James Morgan Price, said he knew what you were thinking. Morgan Price and A used to play a game where Price would visualize something and say, "Hey, George, do you know what I'm thinking about, or do you know what I saw the other day? And A, 100% would see with his spiritual vision. So this is the kind of thing that's going on in the household. There's these experiments. That we would say
what interests me is how this moved on. I mean, that we're well over 100 years ago.
Yes.
My understanding is by 1895, when Blavatsky died, Annie Besant was one of the strands.
That's right.
They found in India a young man called Krishnamurti who was going to be the word teacher.
That's right.
And he was groomed by the Theosophists to be the word teacher.
That's
right? Having that kind of conditioning, in 1925, he stood up and rejected it. And he said, truth is a pathless land.
Yes.
He says it. This was a huge shock to the Theosophists. And his teachings then became very, very interesting. I can see a link back to all that you have been saying, that kind of visually thing. But he kept his feet on the ground. His emphasis was on, look, self-knowledge, more and more on self-knowledge. And Aldous Huxley, there's the Krishnamurti, there's a penguin Krishnamurti book, and Aldous Huxley, who met up with Krishnamurti, said, this guy has a value beyond words. But in parallel to that, you had Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, was Freudian Jung. You can see a pathway there too. Now, Jung had a formidable intellect, but he studied all those visionary cultures, as you know, of India and this, that, and the other. But he was also a magnificent psychiatrist in his time. And he saw in the unconscious and in the dreams of many of his patients all of these, what he called archetypal images, that you can go right back to Blavatsky and even this, that, the other. So he linked it, but pulled it into, if you like, the religions of today and where we are feeling today to see our way through the entrapments of modern times, such that you have what's happening in the Middle East and Ukraine and this, that, and the other. We just haven't learned. So there is a line that can still be traced right back to that visionary time. And that interests me a lot for today.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I would say that any spiritual movers worth their salt always come back to the present and today, very much as A.E. and his circle were at their time. And different people have different talents, different missions. So for A.E., for example, his last book was called The Avatars. And in his old age and failing health, he returns to this idea of the Irish avatar. And he returns almost to the mood of the 1890s, where he'd been working rather bored in drapery business and writing poetry on the sly, and feeling the oppression of the city, really, and feeling the call of the west of Ireland. And in the Avatars, in his last book, he has this vision that a group of people will start to realise that what Blake called the dark satanic mills, the sort of purely materialistic dead culture of money-making and work, is a prison to the spirit. And he has this image of people in Ireland feeling this call to go west, not even realising why they're doing it. I mean, being A, of course, they're poets and painters and writers of various kinds. But I think that for him, there was that sense of, it was always political and it was always connected to the land. And A's last sort of vision that he gave to people before he died was this: it can still happen. People can still live communally, in fairness, social justice, self-sustainably, in harmony with the land, all of these ideas, and they can build a new culture. So for, let's say, Jung grounds it through psychology and through that route, but I think with A and Yates particularly, you're grounding it through beauty and through making the world a more beautiful place through art, and art is central to culture. So I think there are many ways that in our day, there are probably countless ways that someone inspired by religion or theosophy or whatever it is could ground it. It almost doesn't matter what the teaching is that inspires them, as long as you find a way to make it real and healing now. So I couldn't agree more.
Is there anybody in like neo-pagan movements today, 21st century, that links back to the AE kind of, I mean, I know it's part of the kind of big movement. Is there like explicit neo-pagan, or maybe that's the wrong term, but consciousness groups that are?
Do you mean a direct linkage through people, or more generally through the inspiration?
I don't know. I was wondering.
Yeah. Well, actually, Linda, I might call upon you to answer that.
I have an answer.
Yeah.
One of the early neo-pagan groups in the San Francisco Bay Area was founded by a guy named Aiden Kelly. He was part of his graduate school's, I don't know, his study major Greek or something, and he put together a theater performance, and that became a group he called the New Reformed Orthodox Order of the Golden Dawn. And that organization still exists. And I talked to him because I wanted to know where that came from, and if there was a connection to Ella Young, which, of course, that's the connection to Eve. And he said, yes, we had some stuff that she had written in the 30s. And we published it in our magazine in the 70s, and we did use some of it. And this is something I'm trying to track down right now, Patrick, that when I was a young pagan in the 80s, it seemed totally normal to me to use Irish names for the Irish holidays in our pagan rituals. Nobody else was doing that in America. It was a Bay Area thing. And so I think that actually came from Elia. That's my theory. Sally agrees.
I do agree.
I can give an example from England, although it's very pervasive, but it's hard to trace exactly. So I mentioned that Glastonbury became a place, really brought that very direct Irish knowledge into Dean of Fortune's group, because he was a great scholar as well as being a great mystic. And the work that they did together in the 30s then became very influential on the British New Age and pagan scene for the latter part of the 20th century. A lot of people know it has something to do with Dean of Fortune. What many of them don't know is that directly influenced by her Irish collaborators throughout her life. On the subject of Seymour knew the Hermetic Society, the Dublin Hermetic Society, and Aid had passed on the governance of the Hermetic Society to a man called P.G. Bowen, Patrick William Bowen. And Bowen and Seymour made contact, and Arthur Monahan was part of this circle. So Colonel Seymour, Dean of Fortune's great collaborator, came to Ireland, met Arthur Monahan. They went questing at Glendalough. They saw visions, they saw nature spirits, they saw the earth energies. And so what you have is a well-known British esoteric teacher, and it's still not grasped how pervasively she was influenced by the Irish Theosophists and the influence of Irish Theosophy. There's a lot more that can be said about that, but that's probably the main one. And then that spreads to America through the influence of Dean of Fortune.
Thanks very much, James. You mentioned your forthcoming book. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So, well, more than one forthcoming, yeah. I'll mention one book, and then Sally, when I've mentioned Irish magic, would you mind talking a little bit more generally about how you form tracks? So, because, okay. So, in the next couple of months, our history of Irish magic will be published. This is probably about 10 years' work, so thrilled it's finally coming out. And what we've attempted to do is really very ambitious, possibly, in retrospect, I can't believe we took this project on, but we've charted over 2,000 years of belief, spirituality, magic, imagination in Ireland. So we've gone from Druids, the early Celtic Christian period, Middle Ages, fairy lore, witches, all the way through to the Dublin Theosophists, and a lot of the work that I've shared has been inspired by that, and into the 20th century and current continuing revival of Irish myth and magic today. So Sally, Holy Thorn Press, we're publishing this book ourselves. Sally created Holy Thorn Press and I joined a little bit later, so I think it's only fair that you, if you will give a little description.
Sandwiches, very, very quickly. Holy Thorn Press, we're committed to both republishing forgotten and important works related to spirituality, and in particular to Irish mysticism and spirituality. So one of the books we're going to be publishing in about 3 months' time is Ella Young's Flowering Dusk, which are her extremely entertaining memoirs. The first half of it is set her early life in Ireland and her moving and shaking in the Dublin scene along with AE, that whole group of people. Before she goes out to America, she lives in Halcyon, California. She's a very important person who has been unfairly forgotten. She was the first person to teach Irish mythology at a major American university. She had a chair at Berkeley, California, for a number of years. She was also the first person to really introduce Irish mythology in a non-academic way to American audiences through books like The Gohan Sayre and The Tangle-Coated Pony. So that's one of the books. We're also publishing a book about a completely forgotten Irish artist, a very significant person for a period of time in Yeats's life, who was called Althea Giles. She was born in County Kilkenny, but for most of her later career took place in England. She's probably best known to anyone who's seen any of Yeats's early editions as the person who did the beautiful illustrations for his book called Poems, with this beautiful rose designed on the gilt, and her exquisite cover for The Wind Among the Reeds with that wonderful sort of on the cusp of Art Deco, Art Nouveau, these beautiful bending reeds. She had a very strange life, but again, she wrote a lot as well. Nobody knows her writings. She wrote poetry. So I've recently discovered an unknown work of art of hers in an archive in Ireland, which I will be publishing in the book that should come out in the autumn. So that's pretty much it. We've got a website. We're so unbusinesslike. I didn't even bring any business cards.
I have some business.
Oh, yes. So if you'd like to look us up, we do have a functioning website, and we're always very happy to hear from people. We have a mailing list, and we publish regular newsletters, no spam, just stuff about books. And we're always very happy to chat to people. If you've got any questions or anything you'd like to talk to us about, you will always get a response. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Sandwiches.
You're more excited for a second.